Welcome to this edition of What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. This week, we're focusing on the latest updates to the Northern Ireland Protocol and the impact of the Windsor Framework, a recent key post-Brexit effort to ensure a more stable trade and economic relationship for Northern Ireland, United Kingdom, and the European Union. The Windsor Framework was triumphantly unveiled by British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen on the 27th of February. And many more will have their say on the agreement before it's finalized. The agreement now goes to both the British Parliament and the EU member states for a vote, and those vote dates and outcomes as of today are still pending. One other voice with a say on the matter will be our featured guest for this conversation, my Penta Group partner and colleague, Rory O'Donnell. Welcome, Rory.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to be here. First podcast I've ever taken part in, so looking forward to it.
Oh, well, I'm glad to be a part of that, a part of your debut. So, Rory, it's great to have this opportunity to discuss this issue with you because you've been living, breathing, and working on the Northern Ireland Protocol issue for a very long time. Give our audience a brief background on your work and the broader issues before we get to some of the questions about the latest developments.
Sure, Kevin. Happy to. Why don't I start with a little bit about me? So people who listen to accents may have worked out that I'm originally from Northern Ireland. I grew up in Derry during the dark days of the 70s and 80s when things were bad. So I've got quite a bit invested in ensuring that we can build on the great progress that was made in the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, we recognise the role played by the US in that agreement. So I was pleased to work on the protocol. I was a member of the UK Civil Service, so working for the UK government for around 30 years, the last several of which were around negotiations of the various incarnations of the protocol. I mean, in a nutshell, when the UK left the EU, its only land border with the EU was on the island of Ireland. The history of Ireland is a complex one, but both sides recognised very quickly that a land border on the island of Ireland would not be a good thing, not conducive to peace and cross-community relations. So an arrangement had to be found to ensure that there was no hard border on the island of Ireland, but that goods moving within the UK were not a threat to the EU single market. And that gave birth to the original protocol. I think what people found after the protocol operated for a few months is that it created some problems. Unintended, I would say, but there was a reduction in goods flowing from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. Consumers in Northern Ireland noticed shortages of products on their shelves. And so it was necessary to look again at whether we could make the protocol work in a better way. So not have a protocol, but have a more proportionate implementation. And all of that work, I was involved for, I would say 75% of it. All of that work culminated in the Windsor Framework, which, as you said, was announced on the 27th of February. And I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to both teams involved in the negotiations, because I genuinely think it's a really good deal and hopefully will enable Northern Ireland and the UK and the EU to move forward to a more progressive and better relationship. Thanks.
So I think a key part of the implementation will be really understanding how the parties involved got to a deal. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of history here going back to before the Brexit issue ever surfaced. And without going too deep on the fractious nature of the region's politics, let's explore what it was that did go right with the politics of this moment. So what do you think were the elements that came together so that the Windsor Framework could be achieved?
So I think the most important element, and it was very obvious for people who watched the press conference between the Prime Minister Sunak and Ursula von der Leyen, the positive chemistry between those two political leaders, I think, was really important. Negotiators can negotiate anything. But what they really need is political leadership. And I think previous UK Prime Ministers maybe had a less good relationship with their European counterparts. But it was very obvious in the relationship between Sunak and von der Leyen that it was good and positive, and that created the space for negotiators to find solutions. What I've said to a few people is it's as warm a relationship as a UK Prime Minister has had since Tony Blair took over in 1997 and visited Europe and was welcomed with open arms. Ever since then, things have been increasingly difficult, and it's good to see there's now a positive relationship, because with positive relationships, problems are easier to solve.
Do you think, Rory, that diplomacy and that ability that the British Prime Minister has displayed in these negotiations Is it going to be helpful as we start to look at some of the other parties that are now involved in implementation? Is it going to be an important asset that Sunak has going forward with the parties in Northern Ireland?
It certainly is, but that's not to underplay that there are some difficult problems to be solved. I think the Unionist parties in particular, and the DUP in particular, I think still have some concerns. Although it's interesting, a number of Northern Irish politicians are on their annual pilgrimage to Washington for St. Patrick's Day celebrations this week. And Jeffrey Donaldson gave some comments yesterday or the day before, where he recognised that the framework has made the significant progress made as a result of the framework. They still have some concerns, they still have some questions to be addressed, but that's quite a positive statement. Now, that's not to say that in the end everything will be signed up to, but I think it's a step in the right direction. And frankly, for the economic prospects of Northern Ireland and the people of Northern Ireland, I think that's a good thing.
Well, one of the challenges here is that the details of the framework are somewhat complex. Give our audience your best attempt at explaining the core tenets of the agreement in the simplest terms. How will this red lanes, green lanes system work, and what could be some of the compliance challenges?
So at its simplest, the way the red lane, green lane will work, goods that are destined for end consumers in Northern Ireland, so goods basically go into the big supermarkets or going via the big wholesalers to smaller shops, will have no routine checks. They will be able to use the green lane and there will be no routine checks for those goods. Goods that are destined for the Republic of Ireland and therefore the EU single market will have full checks and they will have to use the red lane. Where it's slightly more complicated, but I think will be worked out over time. Goods where the end destination is not clear will need to use the red lane. Because the framework is, in a nutshell, the framework is a balance between ensuring Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom, but also protecting the EU single market. And so the red lane, green lane is there to do that. And if in doubt, I think the red lane will need to be used. But the vast majority of goods consumed in Northern Ireland are consumed through major retailers and major wholesalers. So a very significant percentage will be able to go down the green lane. Now, in terms of reassurances and potential problems, people will need to be registered with a trusted trader scheme. That's not a complex process, but they will need to be part of that scheme. They will need to report what they're doing. There will need to be an ability for the EU and the UK authorities to make sure there's no illegal activity taking place. If there is, there will need to be sanctions against those who take it. But I think we found that over the last 2 or 3 years where the protocol was not very well implemented, there were very few problems. There was very little evidence of goods slipping across the border that shouldn't have. So I'm pretty confident that once we get this up and running, it should work fairly well. My last point would be that in a world where the politics is good, if we do find there are some teething problems, well, it's easier to solve teething problems when the politics are good. And even the smallest problem is hard to solve when the politics are bad. So overall, I'm optimistic about the future.
What's the key to making sure that the politics remains somewhat stable and that people are focused on implementation in a way where the parties involved are trying to be collaborative? What is the key to that? Just continued engagement, making sure that people never really push away from the negotiating table?
Completely right. I think continued engagement. I think early warnings of potential problems and given by both sides. So if the EU think there's something going wrong, it's quickly talk to their UK counterparts. It's quickly get into technical discussions about what the actual issue is. And the same on the part of the UK if they're looking to make legislative change that may have an impact. Early warning to the EU, so that builds trust and a collaborative approach. So I think that's key. And of course, there'll be diplomats from the EU in Ireland and in Northern Ireland and vice versa, and they should keep talking to each other as well.
So I'm going to get in. I want to get into the potential economic impact for the region, but before that, you brought up a very good point. Do business leaders? So you mentioned a lot of the diplomats are going to be very involved, but do business leaders need to get more involved, and what does that engagement look like?
So the business community in Northern Ireland have been the most trusted community over the last 2 or 3 years in discussions of the protocol and its implementation. So they have been very, very much involved in discussions and putting forward suggestions for solutions that might solve some of the problems. And that continued involvement is really important. As luck would have it, one of the business guys, a guy called Stephen Kelly, who I guess will be in Washington this week for St. Patrick's Day, is also Derry. And Derry's a small place. We all know each other. So, I mean, even though I'm no longer part of the UK system, I'm still a person that people can approach and run ideas through and run ideas past. But the business community have been a positive force. And the thing they've done, which I think is really impressive and something that maybe a lot of us could learn from, even though the protocol impacted on different businesses in different ways, and for some businesses, even the old protocol worked quite well for them, they took a unified approach and they decided that it had to work for everybody. If it didn't work for everybody, then there was a problem. And I think that's something that politicians and even diplomats could learn from. But overall, I'm confident in the role business will play and continue to play.
Yeah, that's an important lesson for industry that really want to break through with policymakers and also form coalitions of support with the public is speaking in strength in numbers, speaking with a unified voice.
Yeah.
So I want to focus on impact. What do you think is the potential for the new framework to provide a big economic boost to the region and to the people and businesses that are involved?
Look, it really is, I think, very significant. As the Prime Minister said when he was in Northern Ireland the week before last, Northern Ireland is now in a unique position. It has access to the world's biggest single trading bloc, which is the EU. And it also has access to one of the world's top 6 or 7 economies, which is the UK. And there's nowhere else on earth that has that same level of tariff-free, barrier-free access. And so there is real potential for companies who are thinking about getting involved in Europe to have a good hard look at Northern Ireland. The other thing I'd say, and it's not just because I'm from there, it has a highly educated population. One of the problems in the past is that the population got educated, and because of lack of opportunity, they've left. There's now a real chance for young people in Northern Ireland to go to university wherever they wish to go, but then know that they could return to where they're from to do jobs. And I think in terms of both the economic, but also just the societal benefits that could derive from Northern Ireland are really quite significant.
How big of an impact has that been, Rory, in your lifetime as a drag on the economy, which is the issue of non-returns, and sometimes its greatest export from Northern Ireland has been its people?
Yeah, it's completely true. I left Northern Ireland to go to university in England in the 1980s. And my mum and dad are still there. I have 2 sisters who are there. I have many friends who are there, but I haven't lived there now I've lived outside Northern Ireland for longer than I lived in it. And that is, I wanted to get away at the time. I was happy to be a student in another place. Over the years, I have thought about returning, but the economic prospects are less. They have improved over the last 25 years, but it still lags behind the rest of the UK. And the amount of private sector investment and employment is not high. But I think this really does give a big opportunity for people to look at it. I mean, it has some of the best schools in the UK. It has some of the best O-level and A-level results. So it really does have a skilled and educated workforce. So, I mean, if I was running a company and looking to set up somewhere in Europe, I would be looking very closely at Northern Ireland.
So I think there's anecdotal evidence there in Northern Ireland right now that there's some optimism, but the empirical evidence is pretty solid as well. A recent study by OCO Global forecast that the potential for 33,000 jobs in the next 10 years, with tourism potentially ticking up over 5.5 million visitors a year to Northern Ireland. Do you think that would make a big difference?
I think we could boost those numbers significantly. I mean, tourism has been improving for the last few years. Game of Thrones was probably the biggest boost to the Northern Ireland economy in recent years. It's filmed there, and people go on specific Game of Thrones tours. It's not a program I've seen much of myself, but I'm told people like it. It also has some great heritage. The Grand Giant's Causeway is a World Heritage Site. The city I'm from, Derry, is the biggest walled city, I think, in the UK. The beaches and stuff are great. If the one thing that we could fix that would make tourism even better is the weather. But hey, you don't get Ireland isn't green because it doesn't rain.
Well, I was in County Down last year for a couple of days, and I had 70 degrees and not a cloud in the sky. So maybe we just need me to go back there more often. I brought the good weather with me.
Answer,
yeah. So I want to get a little bit into the politics of it. What do you think the prospects are now for a functional Northern Ireland Assembly at Stormont? Can they finally elect a speaker? Can they finally begin demonstrating that they're ready to govern?
I think that's the biggest question, and that's a question that I think politicians in Northern Ireland, Jeffrey Donaldson in particular, but not just him, will be thinking about now and over the coming weeks. I think the prospects of getting the Assembly back up and running are as good as they have been, but it's far from certain. I think the DUP need to have, and other unionist parties need to have a good hard look at what's there, consider the alternatives, what's the counterfactual. They don't reform the Assembly. I think the framework stays in place anyway. We have another election. We have increased stability. I mean, you basically need two things for businesses to prosper and to consider what they want to do next. You need two things. You need sort of regulatory certainty, but you also need a bit of political certainty. So the Windsor Framework brings a degree of regulatory certainty. People understand what the rules are and how to comply with them. In order to really benefit from that, getting the Assembly back up and running is important. And it also, in the way that sorting this problem allows the UK and the EU to move forward and tackle problems, whether it be Ukraine or China or the energy crisis or climate, I think the Northern Ireland Assembly getting back up and running would allow people to worry a bit less about checks on goods coming from GB and worry a bit more about NHS waiting lists or education or the cost of living crisis that people are facing. So there is a real opportunity to allow this to be to turn the page and move forward to getting on with the things that really matter to people on the ground.
So if we're looking to prioritize one or two things that businesses can do in order to achieve or at least have a voice in that effort for more regulatory certainty, what should they be looking at or doing?
So look, they got to keep. There will be changes, both the UK and the EU over time. Now, probably not as big as people fear, but there will be changes over time. I think the business voice has to be heard loud and clear and unified if possible. On the implications of those changes, particularly if the implications are negative. But there will be cases where they could be positive. So I think business need to remain plugged into the developments on the regulatory side and make sure that their voice is heard. Because in the end, the people who know best what the impact of regulation is the person who has to implement it and the person who's held corporately responsible for ensuring they comply with the law. So business have a really important voice and we should be listening to it.
So again, I want to end with some of your insights on the politics of it, but what's the risk for the political parties who don't embrace implementation with a higher degree of good faith? Is there a risk that they become marginalized?
There is a risk. I mean, the ultimate risk in the end, if we can't get the Assembly back up and running, then the UK government has to call new elections. That the legislation says that. You then get into another electoral cycle. That creates uncertainty. It creates uncertainty on the ground because what will the arguments be? An argument against the Windsor Framework, which is quite a significant concession by the EU, and I'm not sure the EU will concede anymore. So there are implications. The implications could be for overall stability. The other thing, of course, is that when you stand for an election, you either gain votes or you lose them. And that in itself can create some problems. So I think the best thing to do is to avoid getting into that. The best thing to do, I think, is to recognize a good deal when you see one. Maybe recognize that it isn't the most perfect deal you could get, but we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think there's very little doubt when you read the various commentary around the framework, there are very few voices who don't think that it's a significant improvement on what was there before. And of course, over time, we can look to see whether it can be improved again. But much better to be improving something that you're implementing than refusing to get involved and refusing to reform the institutions. I think down that road lies uncertainty, and uncertainty isn't good for the prospects of Northern Ireland.
And for those in our U.S. audiences who are not as familiar with the political system in the UK and the EU and Irish parliamentary elections, how much of a challenge is it when you get into a cycle where you're constantly calling elections and you're constantly litigating these on the campaign trail versus a certain level of stability between elections where you have time to govern?
Look, it creates a lot. It creates a lot of instability because, I mean, nothing happens during an election campaign. There are rules around what decisions can be taken and significant decisions can't be taken. So you have a period of several weeks, sometimes months, where nothing is happening. And, you know, that in itself creates instability. You get results. And I mean, Northern Ireland is a fairly polarised place. It happens to be that Sinn Féin were the biggest party in the last election, with the DUP the second biggest. It's not impossible that could change a bit, but all the polling I see suggests the next result will be fairly similar to this one. So you have the worst of all worlds. You create instability, have an election, and you end up back restarted. And I think that's the thing that we should do our best to avoid. And I genuinely think that all the political leaders in Northern Ireland of all persuasions are looking at those questions and thinking about them. And, you know, they will arrive at their own conclusions. But I think there is a growing sense that the best thing to do is to reform the institutions, to get going, and keep things under review. I mean, nothing is set in stone. If we find in a few years' time that we need to have another look, or there are a few more tweaks that need to be made, well, that's fine. But if we wait until it is perfect from everybody's perspective, then there's no such thing as perfection. I don't think. We got to get the best compromise we can, and this feels like a good one to me.
Yeah, and it just feels like one of the key parts of good policymaking is momentum, and it's hard to get momentum if you're starting and stopping and then restarting the process of governing in between quick fuse elections, right?
Yeah, I think that's completely right. And, you know, I see that Rishi Sunak has invited the President of the United States to visit Northern Ireland, and it looks like he's going to come. That's sort of
how big of a boost is that? I mean, you think back to the Good Friday Agreement and the euphoria that came in the afterglow of the agreement when then President Bill Clinton visited your home area of Derry. And the goodwill and the momentum and the collaborative spirit that brought about. How bullish are you on the prospects of maybe a presidential visit to the area helping?
Look, I think it really helps, and I think the thing that would help as well is if the president's economic envoy to Northern Ireland, Joseph Kennedy III, comes with him, brings some business people. They have a look at what Northern Ireland is like. They think about investment there. I think a combination of a bit of political momentum, a bit of economic momentum and development, I think those are the sorts of things that particularly the young people in Northern Ireland will recognise and appreciate. I mean, I remember I met Bill Clinton, it was sometime after the Good Friday Agreement, but he came to Derry to do a dinner. And he was a superstar. I mean, it was amazing that people remembered the Good Friday deal. They remembered him visiting the Guildhall. And when he came back, it was like a pop star. And so that sort of thing, I think, really resonates with people. And of course, the links between Ireland and the United States, both communities in Northern Ireland and the United States are strong. I read once somewhere that the county on the island of Ireland that has provided the most presidents to the United States is County Antrim. And that is probably Presbyterians who moved over to the States way back when. So the links are not. It's not the Catholics are linked to America and Protestants aren't. I think both communities have very strong ties into the US, and a US president is a US president regardless. And I think him coming really does help, and it should give a boost to things. But let's see. But personally, I think it's a really positive step.
Well, you know, Bill Clinton still recounts that was one of the highlights of his presidency, his trip to Belfast and Derry, and that in the aftermath of the Good Friday Agreement. So, well, I think there's still a lot of optimism. There's still a lot of hope that this trip maybe could serve as a reminder of some of the goodwill of the past. Well, Rory, there's still so much more to discuss on this issue. So much is going to change in the coming days and weeks, even months and years, as the policymakers involved and everyone with a stake in the outcome of the region's economy continues to weigh the impact of the implementation of this agreement. And of course, the team here at Penta, we're going to make sure that we're always one step ahead of all of the latest developments. And among the folks leading that team will, of course, be you, Rory O'Donnell. Rory, so thanks so much for taking time to connect for this podcast today. I'm sure you and I are going to be talking about this issue again.
Look, I'm sure we are. The first time doing it, I really enjoyed it, so I'd be happy to do it again. And I can only echo what you say, Kevin. A company that has offices in Washington, New York, Brussels, Dublin, London, and people like me who have been involved in the inside and the outside of this thing, I think we really have quite an offer to make. So I look forward to working with anybody who wants to talk to us about it.
Same here. And we look forward to working with you. The sun never sets on the Penta Empire.
That's for sure.
So thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. To learn more about Penta, you can visit our website at pentagroup.co. That's pentagroup.co, or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn.